Guys, welcome back to that puzzle. We're just gonna finish up the Muckrakers today. Just some of our lost time from Thursday, Friday of last week. So last week we talked about Lincoln Steffens and Upton Sinclair. Obviously, we just took our quiz on the jungle. Sinclair was tackling worker conditions, right? But obviously, wound up hitting the food industry. Lincoln Steffens, we talked about the Rhode Island estate for sale. We read his article, "The Shame of the Cities." But there are a few others we want to talk about that cover other major facets of American life at the time. Ida Tarbell, who was one of our vocab words, right? She wrote the history of the Standard Oil Company, exposing some of the unethical business practices of John D. Rockefeller, which obviously would open up the floodgates to other robber barons as well. She, in particular, targeted Rockefeller because he drove her father out of business with some of his sweating and unethical practices. So it's these things that are now open to the public that maybe in turn lead to some of the philanthropic efforts that we see of guys like Carnegie and Rockefeller. Jacob Riis, he used photography to expose basically the slums and the tenement housing of New York City in a book called How the Other Half Lives. And certainly we know it's probably much more than half, but his idea was showing what the terrible living conditions for poor immigrants, orphan children, the homeless, what they were forced to endure in New York City. And in particular, as we're going to find out in our next section, had a very heavy impact on Teddy Roosevelt, as he was at the time police commissioner of New York, and eventually will take this into his what we call square deal. Frank Norris, he was not one of our vocab words, but he wrote The Octopus, which was one which we know is a novel all about how railroads exploited the farmers. And certainly we went into incredible depth with that when we talked about the populace. John Spargo is on here for all of you guys who say that you had a really tough day today. I guarantee you that his particular clientele had a much more difficult day. He wrote about the Breaker Boys of Pennsylvania, who were responsible for working in the coal mines and in his book, The Bitter Cry of Children, he depicts the brutal 12-hour days and the terrible working conditions that children were forced to endure, breaking large pieces of coal into small pieces of coal to be sold off by using their hands and very small instruments. So anybody who says they had a really tough day, I guarantee you the Breaker Boys had a tougher one. So we're exposing child labor, right? The other one that I don't have mentioned on here, but is in your documents, which you're going to take a look at, is Ida B. Wells. And her focus was on really exposing the lynching habits that were occurring in the South, right? Lynching is a form of, it's a crime that's taken by, at the time, white supremacists in the South in order to really rid themselves of African Americans who sought to upend what they saw as the status quo. And in this case, you might have several members of the KKK or other white supremacist organizations that would string a rope up over a tree, tie a noose, and they would hang African Americans. And it was, this was meant to send a message to African Americans to get them to stop participating in voting, right? Stop running for government, stop standing up for their individual civil rights. And we'll certainly see that this will be a pattern that will grow, especially when we get into the 1920s with the rise of the KKK. So all of these muckrakers and other ones that are listed here, they're successful in their own way, right? But generally, as we see in America, it takes a little bit more than that. It takes some kind of tragic event for us to really recognize that change needs to happen, right? Think, school shootings or 9/11, right? Those are the kinds of things that generally, because of their public nature and because of what's thrown out in the news media, really forces Americans, it makes them get angry and it makes them call for change. And unfortunately, it's a similar event that occurs here that really starts to change child labor and labor laws across the country, and that's the Triangle Factory Fire. In New York City, there was a company called the Triangle Shirtwaist Company, and they had a factory. And they employed young girls there, particularly from Jewish and Italian nearby neighborhoods. And unfortunately, March 25th, 1911, a fire breaks out at the company. Only one person was able to escape. And because of the terrible working conditions, we're talking locked doors, we're talking towels put up against the door to keep the heat up, iron barred windows. Very few people were able to escape. And unfortunately, and just as like a little warning, you're going to see something kind of graphic, 146 Jewish and Italian girls were killed, burned to death inside of this factory fire. Some of them even jumped out of the 10th story of the building in order to avoid burning alive. So you have this graphic nature or this graphic crime that is put on the national news, and you see these images like the ones I talked about here. You can certainly see the fire here. Even here you see what is left of that burnt building. And it's when this is put out into the mainstream media that change is called for. Right? The owner of the building himself was indicted on counts of manslaughter, which is a step down from murder, if you will. Right? It's murder, but it's not necessarily premeditated. But he was never convicted for his crimes, even though much of what he required for his working conditions led to the death of these 146 girls. And unfortunately, it's this event that really pushes forward reforms in labor laws, as well as building labor codes in terms of like inspections. So by 1917, just about every state starts to enact similar policies, like limiting the number of hours that can be worked in a week, like setting the maximum. Several states start to set minimum wage standards for women, and we start to hopefully eliminate the idea of child labor as well. So you start to create pensions, stricter inspections for municipal building codes and for working, factory inspections. What we consider today now on-the-job accident insurance, right? You think of like those Aflac commercials, right? Like those kinds of things are created as a result of this, because of what people see in these terrible pictures, really forces them to make change. And it's unfortunate that it takes this event, but we finally do get real lasting change from this.